Okay, so we've been going through chapter 17. We've been talking about the great harlot. We've been talking about the scarlet beast. And we've described this great harlot as the idolatry and that system specifically of kind of that sinful desire within the empire, and how that the idolatry kind of served that purpose of being able to do what they wanted to do. And this is part of the reason why we see in verse 2 that the kings of the earth, the spiritual fornication, and to a certain extent physical fornication, because that certainly was a part of communing with the gods and goddesses of Rome and of Greece. But we see how that they were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. In other words, Rome is drawing in all people. Of course, they're enforcing the service of idolatry. They're enforcing this sin. And then we see, though, that in verse 4, her cup is full of abominations, the filthiness of her fornication, but she is drinking of the blood of the saints, verse 6. Because this system of idolatry and all of the elements that went into it was then turning to Christians as a threat. They saw Christians as a threat to their way of life and the things that they wanted to do, trying to teach this one true God. We talked about Pliny the Younger and how that he wrote to the Caesar, and how that Christians are a threat to everyone in our way of life. And that's why he sought to make them recant, and if they wouldn't recant, he put them to death. So we see in verse 7 and 8, we talked about the beast on which this woman sits. And we describe this beast as the political element of the Roman Empire, in particular, the elements within it that were corrupt and that sought to prop up idolatry. And in particular, that would certainly include the emperors that sought worship for themselves. These are emperors who sought to be worshipped as living deities, divine mortals. And as he describes in verse 8, this is what the end of this beast is going to be. And this describes the fact, it's not that the Roman Empire was completely wiped out. It wasn't. But that system within it that propped up idolatry and that enforcement of idolatry was destroyed. And we see in verse 9, here is the mind which has wisdom, and then he's going to describe what this is all about. Now, we ended here week before last, and we described our questions. I think we went through our questions with question 8, I think was the last one. Does Revelation 17 and verse 8 teach that all those who will be saved have already been decided since the earth was created? Is this describing predestination? No, the book of life has existed from creation. Okay, since Adam and Eve, the book of life has existed, and all those who are written in the book of life are those who submit and obey the Lord. It's not that God has written each individual person's name into that book. So moving on to verse 9 and 10, but specifically describing this beast and kind of what all of this represents. This is the rest of chapter 17. And I wanted to point out one of the things that Homer Haley mentions in his commentary about this particular section. He says, if the number 7 is understood to be a symbolic representation of the whole or complete number, then the Roman Empire was but the embodiment and continuation of several kingdoms of men, which Satan influenced to oppose God. We talked about how that this beast, it embodied the Roman Empire, but the fact that this beast was not and yet was. The fact that it was there and then it went away and now it's come back, and how that the earth marveled at this. This is just this whole, in the entire system of this world empires that is embodied in Assyria, it's embodied in the Babylonian Empire, and these kingdoms, they come and go, but they worship their own gods, they seek to follow their own idols, and now Rome is embodying that same spirit, the same system, and enforcing their same idolatry. Although at the time of Revelation, the beast was embodied in the Roman Empire, he actually becomes a generic symbol for all the secular anti-God kingdoms that have ever existed. That's from Parkwriter, page 222 in his commentary. The second part is Brother Haley. The beast represented the total of forceful anti-Christian or anti-theistic opposition. The harlot represented that which is lustful, enticing, and seductive, all that appeals to the flesh. The 7 kings, therefore, were a symbolic number, representing all kings or kingdoms, past, present, and future, that would oppose the kingdom of God. Each who would come would still be part of the 7. Although kingdoms arise out of the upheavals of the sea of society, their anti-God rulers originate in the abyss, the satanic realm. And we recognize that about how this kingdom comes from the abyss and it goes to perdition, to ruin. It's not that the Roman Empire came from Satan per se, but those elements within the empire that was specifically anti-God and certainly anti-Christian was. Each continues for a little while, then goes into perdition, which is the end of all who oppose God. And this is it really summarizes the rest of this chapter, because this is what is going to describe that judgment. You know, at the very beginning of chapter 17, one of the angels that had the 7 bowls, he says, I'm going to show you the judgment of the harlot. And this is describing, the rest of this chapter is going to describe what's going to happen and how this is all going to end. So starting in verse 9, he says, here is the mind which has wisdom. You need to understand what I'm saying. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Certainly there were 7 hills. Oh, I wonder if I still have that. I had found a picture which kind of shows let's see, and I forgot all about bringing it up, or not Acts, the 7 hills. Oh, Revelation, there we go. Let's see if I've got that in here somewhere. And how that these 7 hills in Rome, how that all the city of Rome was built upon these 7 hills. And it was, let's see. I didn't save it to it. But anyway, maybe next week I'll remember to have it. But there's these 7 hills, and Rome was known for these 7 hills. The different things were built on these different places, and it was all encompassed within Rome. And so anytime anything was mentioned regarding the 7 hills or the 7 mountains, it was the city of Rome that was instantly brought to people's minds. Now, again, I think there is both a figurative sense, because the number 7 features prominently in the book of Revelation, meaning something that is complete. In this case, it represents the complete empire of the complete Roman Empire. But the fact that the 7 hills were also literal leaves no doubt that that's what we're talking about. So then in verse 10, he says there's also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue for a short time. Commentaries go crazy over this, trying to figure out, well, which kings is he talking about? They try to associate it to Rome. They try to associate it to different, maybe, dynasties within the family members and so forth of Rome. And yet, what are the numbers of Revelation? Are they ever literal, per se? They're always figurative or symbolic. And so the idea of 7, okay, that's a completion, which is to say the complete number of those that God is going to allow to declare this war against the saints and to persecute the Christians. Again, that's the context. We're not talking necessarily about Rome before this war started, or even before the church was established. It was when the persecution started, particularly there in the late 90s and so, and as that persecution started building and grew harder and harder and worse, he's describing this series of emperors who are just going to increase worse and worse. They're going to seek their own worship. They're going to seek to enforce the idolatry. And so if we're talking about 7, and then he mentions 5 have come. Well, if 5 have come, do we have more than that to come or less than that to come? We have less than that to come. Meaning this is towards the end of what God's going to allow. Okay, there's only 2 left, in essence. The sense in which one is, this is the current time, not literal emperor, not literal Caesar, but this is the current time, and then there's going to be a time again, but then it'll end. There won't be any more after that. Again, well, what is it, the end of the empire itself? No. It's the end of that idolatry and that insistence on enforcing the idolatry. So, in other words, he's telling the saints, we're almost through. This is almost over. Well, this is the angel speaking, but this is almost done. And so when he says, when he comes, he must continue a short time. Notice how we're talking about time frame here. Not literal kings, the sense in which the saints must continue to endure, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. At some point, there's not going to be this war against the saints anymore. Anything through verse 10?
Michael?
Yeah.
But you go back to verse 9, you just said that the 7 mountains refer to the 7 hills.
Yes.
So you take that literally, and then you switch to figuratively.
Yeah.
So how is it that a person just reading this can distinguish which is the 2?
Well, I think the verse 9, it gives the immediate thought process of the Roman Empire. That's all it's meant to be. It's not meant to be literal hills and mountains, but the sense in which that connection is automatically made to Rome because of the 7 hills that exist there. So it's an identifying feature of what the figurative or symbolic element is. And that's where the symbolic element is, which is verse 10. These are these kings. That's what those who rule there in Rome. And so the idea of these 7 kings, it still fits within these 7 mountains, representing the fullness of Rome, and in particular, the fullness of their power to try to declare war on the saints. And so I'm not saying that it's both literal and figurative. It's a sense in which there is this acknowledgement that because of those 7 hills in Rome, everybody understands exactly where we're talking about. We can identify it immediately who's being described here. Because then when he goes to talking about these 7 kings, these are those which they have the fullness of authority of the Roman Empire. That's where it dwells. That's the throne of the Roman Empire, is Rome. Any other thoughts to that? So verse 11, it goes on to say, the beast which was, or that was and is not, is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. Now, how can this beast, and remember how we've identified this beast, how can this beast be the 8th king, or for that matter, 8th hill, 8th mountain, but he's of the 7, and he too is going to perdition? Remember, we're talking about the concept of completion with 7. Well, here, this beast that was and is not, he himself is the 8th. It's that spirit and that embodiment of idolatry that has been within this beast, certainly embodied within the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and all the world empires that have come. Now, this beast that was not, he's kind of representative of all 7. And for that matter, all of the kingdoms of men, or particularly the world empires of men, for all time. That's what this beast, it kind of represents, specifically that idol worship, that desire to serve oneself, for that sinful pleasure of the world. That's what this beast is. When he says he's of the 7, he's the 8th, but he's of the 7. In other words, he's the same. This is kind of what props these 7 up. This is what these 7 are kind of focused on, meaning this is what the empire and its political branch was being used for, was to prop up idolatry, prop up this sense of desire for what I want. And because that beast, and certainly the beast is propping up the great harlot, this beast, he's kind of this 8th king or 8th hill. In fact, he's the same as the 7. It's just kind of all embodied into one thing. Go ahead, Gilbert.
I think you hit the nail on the head. The 7 mountains are a situation, a condition, a type of evil, and the 8th one is that same type of evil, but it's so much more powerful than the 7 mountains. It gets a little bit of a different classification.
Yeah.
But it's still evil.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like one mountain that comprises them all, so to speak. Okay, this is all 7 are of this 8th, is the idea. All 7 of these kings, and for that matter, all the world empires that have existed, they're of this 8th beast, or this beast which is of the 8th, of the 7, because this is what he embodies. He embodies them all. And again, it's that ultimately the beast and the great harlot, who do they both serve? They both serve Satan. Just like, and this is, remember we paralleled this back to chapter 13, how that you had the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth. The beast of the sea was this political element of the Roman Empire that sought to prop up the idolatry, sought to declare war on the saints, whereas that beast of the sea was the false prophet. It was this idol, the system of idolatry that sought not only to serve idols and to serve the emperors as gods, but to enforce it. And basically we have the exact same thing described here, except what is being emphasized in chapter 17 is the relationship between the woman and the beast. We didn't have that revealed in chapter 13. Chapter 13 is just defining who these 2 other players are, I guess you could say, in addition to the great dragon, which is Satan. These 2 serve the great dragon. Together, they work together to serve the great dragon. The political element of the Roman Empire, the corrupted element of the Roman Empire, was serving with idolatry to promote what Satan wanted to happen, which is this war against the saints at the end of chapter 12. Well, here now we have the relationship between the two. The woman's in charge. Normally you think the political element of an empire, of any government is, well, for us it should be the people, right? But in this case, it's idolatry. That's what they served, their own corruption, their own desire for power, and idolatry was the means by which it turned the political structure any way it wanted. Now the political structure propped her up, but she was in charge. Anything else through verse 10? Or verse 11, rather. All right, he goes on to say in verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. We talk about the number 7 being the sense of completion. The number 10 is the sense of fullness of power. And throughout Revelation, we've seen that correlation, and certainly numbers that kind of suggest a complete lack of power or a complete lack of completion. Well, here you've got these 10 kings. Well, if the 7 kings of verse 9 and 10 are not literal, then the 10 kings here in verse 12 are not literal. In fact, he even describes they have received no kingdom as yet. In other words, they have no dominion of their own. They simply are lackeys of the Roman Empire. And remember how earlier we saw with verse 2, how that the kings of the earth, they committed fornication. They're all on board. They're all involved in this. Not only are they complicit in idolatry, but they're also complicit in the killing of the saints. So that being the case, these 10 horns that you saw, they have no dominion. They're vassals of the Roman Empire. They serve ultimately the empire. They yield themselves. They receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. For 1 hour declares it's a short time, just a short period of time. And this sense in which they are complicit and perhaps even helping in the war against the saints. Remember what those 3 unclean spirits sought to do? The only time in the New Testament where the term Armageddon is found. What were those 3 unclean spirits doing? Gathering all the kings of the earth for a war against the Lamb. Well, this is that, verse 12 and verse 13, that battle that it was described, or that was mentioned, and then described later on in chapter 18, that's that 1 hour as kings with the beast. In other words, they're right there supporting the beast. That political corruption, that desire to do oneself, and it's embodied in this idolatry of these idols. Well, all the kings of the earth, all those who have any authority, they don't have any dominion of their own. Basically, Rome has it, but they're right there and complicit with it. Verse 13, they're of one mind. They have the same purpose. They have the same thoughts. They give their power and authority to the beast. That same structure that supports and upholds the idolatry and the war against the saints, they're right along with it. Verse 14, these will make war with the Lamb. There's your 1 hour. Okay, this isn't describing some real alliance that took place or some treaty that was signed. It's simply describing this battle. Well, the war's been going on for a while now. What specifically is being described in verse 14 seems to be that battle, sometimes referred to as Armageddon. Remember, what does Armageddon literally mean? The hill of Megiddo. And is there an actual hill of Megiddo? No. There is no hill in Megiddo. It's a plain at the mouth of the Jezreel Valley. There is no hill there, but it is known as a place of conflict. It's known as a place of death, of war. And this is why. Verse 14, they will make war. Well, the war's been taking place all along. I mean, the fact that these two already exist, the beast and the great harlot, they're making war against the saints. In fact, the harlot, she's drinking the blood of the saints. This specifically is describing that battle. And remember, we talked about that battle, and we'll talk more about it in chapter 18. There's only a couple of verses given to it, but it's the idea of that final destruction of this enforcement of idolatry. That final, this ultimate victory that Jesus is going to have, and that kind of releasing of this war. No longer will the saints be made war against by the empire and complicit in seeking the death of the saints. These will make war with the Lamb. The Lamb will overcome them. And why will he overcome them? because he's Lord of Lords and he's King of Kings. I think that's great, the verse 14. How is he going to overcome them? Is he going to overcome them with chariots, with soldiers? His weapons are going to be made of a special metal? No. He's going to overcome them because he is Lord of Lords and he's King of Kings. He is master of all. His dominion is over all. Even the kings of the earth, even over those who serve the great harlot and the scarlet beast, he is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. There is no other but him. That's why he'll overcome. All powerful. And what did Jesus say in Matthew 28 to the apostles? All what? All power, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. The Lamb is going to overcome them. Does he say that the saints are going to fight them? No. Nowhere in the New Testament is the Lord's or the Lord's people ever described as soldiers in a physical battle. It's a spiritual one. Those who are with him, those who are on his side, sometimes we sing the hymn, who shall follow Jesus? Master, here am I. Those who are with him, what are they called? They are what? They're called, they're chosen, and they're faithful. The idea of being called and chosen and faithful carries with it the understanding of how they came to be with him. That's what it's describing. How did they come to be with him? And we have several different references in the New Testament to the idea of the saints being called. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 14, and how that we're called through the gospel to serve him, to submit to him. And that means, well, what are we not going to be serving? We're not going to be serving ourselves and our own lusts and desires, which means we're not going to be serving the idols either, because that's ultimately the means by which they served themselves. People did. We're not going to be like them and the submitting to the world, being conformed to the world, Romans 12, but rather we're going to be transformed by the Word of God. We're called through the gospel, and not only are we called to understand that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, that he was raised and now sits at the right hand of the throne of God, but we're called to be pure, called to be holy as I am holy, as Peter mentions that God said, be holy for I am holy. We're chosen. Are we individually chosen? Or is the character of the people of faith, is that chosen? From the beginning of time, God has chosen the character of faith. Now, the different laws, did that mean the different people of faith, or the different people who were his people, did they abide by different laws? Patriarchal law, Mosaical law, law of Christ? Sure. But the character of faith, has it ever changed? Ever? No. Hebrews 11 makes that clear. The same character of faith that was in Abraham, that was in Enoch, is the same character of faith, chapter 12, verse 1. Since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, the same faith is in us. And then faithful. Faithful, the idea of convicted, persuaded, and because I'm convicted and persuaded that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that he was raised from the dead, I am therefore convicted and persuaded of his promise that one day I will be raised unto eternal life. And because I am convicted of that promise, what am I going to be willing to do? What does Jesus call on the saints at Smyrna to do in Revelation 2? Be faithful unto death. I'll give you the crown of life. So that's why those who are with him, how did they come to be with him? Because they were called through the gospel. They answered the call. They conformed or transformed themselves, rather, their character to the faith that is described, the character that is described in the gospel. And now they've submitted to that, and they're faithful always, even unto death. That's what makes them with him. Any thoughts through that? Verse 15. Huh?
I find it interesting, just backing up just a hair. With verse 8, you wrote back, you talk to those that are wondering, what these things are going on.
Yeah, they marvel.
Verse 9, here's the mind of wisdom. So here's the insight, here's the real answer, what's really happening, versus wondering what all this is about, the events and all that.
You're absolutely right. Remember the name of the woman that was written on her, mystery, and we talked about this term mystery. Our modern definition of this means we can't know or we don't know. It's a mystery. It's hidden. And yet the New Testament term means, no, it's no longer hidden. It once was, but now it's been revealed. And for those who have wisdom, can they see through what all of this means? Can they see through the lies of idolatry? Can they see through the efforts of the Roman Empire in particular and what it was seeking to serve? Was it seeking to serve that which was good, just in general, that which was good? No. It sought to serve themselves. And that's what a people full of self-ambition, of self-zeal, of self-desire, that's what it was all about. And that's why when John, when he marvels at the end of verse 6, it's, I marveled with great amazement. In other words, there was this shock. There was this surprise. And I don't think it was because he didn't necessarily understand so much that this is now being revealed. It's the idea that how is it that this woman can present herself like like she's royalty, as if she's to be honored, when in fact she's a harlot. And that's why the angel says in verse 7, well, why are you shocked? Why are you surprised? Let me tell you about this woman and the beast, the relationship between these two. This is why nobody seems to understand. This is why nobody sees through the charade. They don't see through it. Why? Because they're blinded by their own self-interest. They're blinded by their own desires. They're blinded by the idolatry. And they don't want to see it. But those who are with the Lord, they choose to see through it. They understand the truth, and the truth sets them free, not only from sin, certainly, but from any attempts by Satan to try to pull them away from the Lord, to try to lure them, whether it's through the idea of desire and seeking to serve those things so I can do what I want, or even pressure from the beast seeking to kill the saints. They're going to be faithful unto death. Verse 15, he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Why do you suppose that's at this point that the angel reveals that? Because we were introduced to the fact that the woman was sitting at the waters back in verse 1. Why only now is the angel describing this is where she sits, this is what this represents? Because remember verse 3, we find that she sits on this beast. See, I think he's emphasizing the woman and where she's standing, because ultimately while the beast has the political power over all the world, who truly has a grasp on the world? Who's truly in charge? Satan is through what? Idolatry. And through this system that promotes the self-seeking and self-desire. Satan's in charge. That's why we're told the woman, she's sitting at the waters. Why is that important? Yes, the beast is there. The beast provides kind of the political and military structure to it. But ultimately, it's the woman and the position she has over all the world. She's serving the great dragon Satan. The beast is serving the great dragon Satan. This is Satan's last stronghold, if you will. Not to say that he won't continue to be able to influence peoples and influence kingdoms even, but this is his last bastion, the last time he would ever be able to enforce idolatry over the whole known world. Never again would it happen. Verse 16. Anything through verse 15? Verse 16. The 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Now, it's kind of interesting because we see this idea of what these vassals and these kind of conspirators are going through with the relationship to Rome. Right now, they're serving Rome. Right now, they're involved and complicit not only in idolatry and in sin, but in hating the saints and seeking to kill the saints. But what's always true when it comes to ambition of men? You ever hear of backbiting and backstabbing even within people who are supposed to be friends? Family, political parties. And here you have that same ambition. Sometimes we refer to dog eat dog, right? It's a dog eat dog world. Because while sometimes they're going to be friends and they'll travel in a pack for a while, when they see an opening, if there's an opportunity for self-promotion, whether it's as an individual king or as a country, as a nation, sometimes they take advantage of that, right? Any sign of weakness. And what has God been describing is going to happen to Rome? Over the next several hundred years, Rome is going to degrade. Both politically, their society is going to start to degrade. There's going to be natural disasters like earthquakes, volcanoes erupting. There's going to be great disease. Remember I mentioned that Estonian plague of 170, 180 AD that wiped out a third of the people of the Roman Empire. And these nations that are simply biding their time, yeah, we're going along with you, they're going to eventually turn. And as we noted earlier, there's going to be invasions of Rome with military, just as God used Babylon against Assyria, and just as God used both Assyria and Babylon against Israel and Judah, and God has used these nations all along to bring about judgment or to bring about his providence, he does the same with Rome. These 10 horns, these 10 beasts, again, not literal nations, not literal kings, but the sense of those vassals, those around Rome, which for now are biding their time and waiting, they're going along for now so that they don't get destroyed, they're going to come back and bite Rome. They'll hate the harlot. An interesting thing about that, and it may be that there's an even deeper layer here in the fact that Rome sought to enforce its gods. Was it just on Christians? It was on everybody. They didn't just incorporate all the gods of every nation that they conquered. They enforced their gods, the gods of Rome and Greece, on everyone, not just Christians, or attempted to on Christians. So it makes you wonder if they will hate the harlot. And harlot kind of represents specifically this service of idolatry and service to these emperors even, and that's something else they would seek to enforce. And over time, listen, we have our own gods. We don't want to serve your gods. We don't want to serve your emperor, your Caesar, or worship him as a god. We don't want to look at things like that. And so perhaps even that second layer element of we want to do our own thing and we don't want to do what you're telling us to do. And so they fight back. They make her desolate and naked. In other words, there's nothing left. There's going to be such a pushback. They're going to eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Notice the complete destruction, complete wiping away that's being described there in verse 16. This is her judgment. That's the very thing that this angel told John he would show. I'll show you the judgment of this harlot. I'm going to show you what's going to happen to her. In fact, in some ways, the first thing I thought about with verse 16 was Jezebel. Not that the same exact things happened to Jezebel, but did Jezebel reach kind of a similar disgusting end? Yeah. Remember what happened to her? She fell off the tower, and then what happened? Dogs ate her. Kind of gross. Same concept of this harlot, for whatever reason, I'm thinking of Jezebel. And of course, she's even mentioned in Revelation, chapter 3, I believe. Well, here, verse 16, you kind of have that same type of finality to it. Thoughts or comments through verse 16? All right, verse 17. God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose. Let's stop right there for a second. Is God forcing these other nations to turn on Rome? Did God force Pharaoh to refuse Moses? I mean, we're told throughout the Old Testament, or throughout the Exodus, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Maybe.
Sorry?
He made him make a choice.
Made him make a choice. In the sense that, yeah, God had built him up to this, allowed him this power, allowed him to be worshipped as God on earth. God knowing full well that this character within him is going to deny the request of Moses to let the people go. And even after all the plagues, until the last one, and even then, after the last one, what happened to Pharaoh? What did he do? He changed his mind again, remember? He sent his armies after him. So God knew full well that because of the position he's in, because of the mind he has, the arrogance and conceit, the self-ambition that he's filled with, he's not going to listen. And God allowed him to reach that position. But did that in any way change the fact that Pharaoh made those decisions himself? He chose it. And this is the same way. God has put it into their hearts. Well, how? by allowing them the positions that they're in, by allowing Rome to have dominion over them, by allowing Rome to enforce their, okay, God's allowing this stuff. Certainly it's from Satan, but God is waiting. And now he's put it into their hearts, and as he's going to bring about through his providence the weakening of Rome, he knows these nations around Rome are just waiting for an opportunity. They're waiting for a chance, and then they're going to see an opening and they're going to take it. Until, notice he says, to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Which is to say, they're waiting too. They're of one mind. They all hate Rome, but we can't do anything about it. There's nothing we can do. They're going to give their kingdom. Remember, these 10 kings, they have no kingdom of their own. Well, they've given their kingdom in the sense of their dominion. Okay, their authority. They've yielded that to Rome. But they're waiting until the words of God are fulfilled. When Rome begins to start to crumble from within, and all of these events start to take place, and all of a sudden, they're going to converge. Verse 18, the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And again, that great city isn't Rome itself. It is that Rome is being represented by Rome because of the seat of power and authority, but it is that idolatry being spread from Rome and enforced from Rome, upheld by the political structure of Rome, who sought only themselves. They only cared about what they wanted. Thoughts or comments through verse 18? All right, let's cover our questions for chapter 17, this final part here. We talk about the 7 heads and what they represent, and how does the symbolism of the heads factor into this. So we talk about the 7 heads with regard to these, to this beast, and how that we know that they're kings. We also know there's an immediate association with Rome. So we're talking about these kings associated with Rome. This period of time, these individuals who have come and gone, not literal individuals, but representative of the Caesars during this war especially. Well, what does the head have to do with it? Why is it that we aren't talking about the 7 crowns? The head, what does the head represent? We talk about the head, we talk about crown. Crown represents a sense of glory, of victory, even if they believe it's victory when it really isn't. But the idea of crown, of one who is powerful. The head represents what? Control and knowledge. Yeah, control and knowledge. And this ability of this authority of being able to have dominion over, that's what's being represented there in verse 10. Just like we talked about with that beast back in chapter 13 with the 7 heads and the 10 crowns. The crowns, there's glory, there's authority certainly involved in that, but the sense of glory and of promotion, the heads represents thought and authority. And that being the case, that concept of heads, that's why that factors into that. That's why they're quote unquote the heads of this beast. They're specifically over this authority of the political structure that's seeking to prop up the idolatry in the service of seek to serve the Caesars as if they're gods. Question 2, what do the 10 horns represent? How does the symbolism of horns factor into this? So the 10 horns, what do we find those as being verse 12? Again, is it literal? It's figurative for these vassals, these kind of individual places, kingdoms in a sense, but they're ultimately under the service of Rome. But what does the term horn represent? Power. Yeah, power or strength. Now keep in mind, they're on this beast, okay? But they're not really a part of Rome. Rome is simply made these others submit, but they still have a little bit of power on their own. We talk about death by 1,000 cuts. Does one cut hurt you? Does 2 cuts really do anything? Dwayne cries because he's interesting. But these 1,000 cuts, though, what can happen? Eventually, 1,000 cuts, you can bleed to death if you have that many cuts. And that's kind of the concept here, where you have these 10, it's not literal 10, but it's all these other vassals, it's all these other groups that Rome has subjugated, and they've sought to enforce their values and their idolatry on these others. Eventually, they're going to start fighting back. Question 3, what parallels can be seen between the symbolism of Daniel 7 and Revelation 17?
Reigns or successions of kings.
Yes. Remember, Daniel 7 has been a focal point of Revelation, in addition to other parts of Daniel as well. But Daniel 7 especially, because that's where Daniel, it is described to him in this vision, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the rise and fall of kings, and how that there's prophecy about this war against the Lamb, war against the saints, ultimately. And that's exactly what's being described here, but that one day, God will cause this all to end. They won't succeed. Question 4. What 2 attributes of Jesus are used to establish why he would have victory over the beast? Lord of Lords and King of Kings. There is no other who is master. There is no other with true authority and power and dominion than him. Question 5. What 3 adjectives are used to describe the saints, and what does each mean? They are what? They're called, they're chosen, and faithful. Okay, and as we described, the fact that they're called through the gospel, meaning they hear the word, and what comes by hearing? Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Okay, that's how saints are called. And because they're called, they're chosen, meaning they hear what the character that God wants them to have, they submit to that, they are transformed to that, and then ultimately they remain faithful. They're convicted and persuaded, therefore they're faithful unto death.
In a progression of all are called, and there's those that are chosen, and then there's those that are faithful.
That's just a really good point. The idea of progression here, many are called, but few are what? Chosen. Not in the sense that God's specifically choosing, but many people can hear the gospel. But is everyone going to be willing to allow themselves to be transformed into what God wants them to be? No. And even more so, those who may make that decision initially, does that mean they're always going to remain faithful? Remember what Pliny the Younger said? He sought to cause Christians to recant and renounce the name of Jesus. He said those who are true Christians can't be made to renounce Christianity. Suggesting that there may have been some who did, because they sought to save their own life. So yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm going to have to add that to my notes. The idea of a kind of a progression there as well. Sure. All right, question 6, last question for our notes. What will eventually happen to the harlot? She's going to be absolutely destroyed. Ultimately, the idea of being made desolate, being made naked, her flesh is going to be eaten, and she's going to be burned with fire. And in some ways, this might even describe a progression as well. And the sense of being made desolate and naked describes a stripping away of all those pleasures of life. Remember how she was described before? All those things are going to be taken away. There's not going to be left anything for her. No ambition anymore. This idolatry is going to be stripped of its beauty, of its appeal, and then she's going to be eaten. That flesh, the harlot, the idea of idolatry being torn apart, and then it's going to be burned with fire. Now you can take that in the sense of symbolically, in the sense of it being put away, but there's also the sense of what? What's going to happen to all those who serve her? What's their judgment going to be? Just like her. Thrown into the lake of fire, along with the devil and his angels. Perdition, ruin. All right, how would this come about and why? What's God going to use? All these other groups, these other kingdoms are going to turn against them because God has put it in their heart to fulfill his purpose. Because he's promised there will be an end to this war, and he's going to bring it about. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, so stay faithful unto death. All right, after we'll stop, I'll have chapter 18 notes available Wednesday night, and we'll pick up there next week. Thank you, everybody.